I've been doing deals for a long time. I've been making lots of wonderful deals, great deals. That's what I do.
President Trump is a businessman, not a politician. In his mind, you buy the company, you walk in, everybody then does your bidding, and if not, you fire them.
Never, ever, ever in my life have I seen any transaction so incompetently negotiated as our deal with Iran.
Il avait trouvé cet accord stupide. L'accord sur l'Iran était un accord conclu par des stupides. Des stupides dont la France était. Hein.
One of the most divisive presidents in history, riding roughshod over conventions at home and abroad. In this episode, Donald Trump tackles the Middle East, from the nuclear deal with Iran to bringing US troops home.
Hillary and our failed establishment have spent $6 trillion on wars in the Middle East that we never win.
Well, I didn't throw my hands up in the air because that would have lost the phone, but I thought this is exactly the wrong thing to do at this time.
It was shocking. President Trump thought that he could treat Iran as they would treat their clients in the region.
Trump brings his own brand of diplomacy to one of the world's most volatile regions.
We will move the American embassy to the eternal capital of the Jewish people, Jerusalem.
I remember coming in and saying, if this happens, Jared, this will be the last meeting between us.
When President Trump makes a promise, he keeps it.
He takes America to the brink of war and unveils an unexpected deal.
At ease, at ease. Let's have a good time.
We have breaking news out of Syria this morning. There's new video showing several people were attacked with a suspected chemical agent.
Donald Trump was just getting his feet under the Oval Office desk when a major crisis exploded onto his agenda.
And here it is. These reports, if confirmed, are horrifying and demand an immediate response by the international community.
In the early hours of the morning, the Syrian government launched an airstrike on a rebel stronghold near Idlib in northwest Syria.
Last night, a helicopter from the Syrian government apparently dropped some sort of improvised explosive device called a barrel bomb.
Dozens of civilians were killed. Early reports suggested chemical weapons had been used.
We assembled in the president's office for his first item of business, which was the president's intelligence briefing. And the way the White House is set up between the residence and the Oval Office, there are these floor-to-ceiling windows right outside the Oval Office, and I and several others, the vice president, his national security advisor, a few other senior officials, were standing right at the windows. And we could see President Trump walk from the residence across the colonnade, and steam was coming out of his ears. He was angry, he was upset. He sat down at his desk, pulls out the newspapers and says, "Did you see this?" And he's showing the pictures of the women and children who had been gassed. And he said, "I want to take him out." In other words, he wanted to assassinate the Syrian president, Assad. I'm looking around at all my colleagues, all the men in the room, thinking, come on, guys, back me up here. They were all looking at their shoes, and I said, well, Mr. President, you can't do that. He said, why? And I said, well, that's an act of war. He said, well, we already are at war. They're already at war with us. This is war. I said, well, but it's not an official declaration of war. Trump glares at me, folding his hands in the serious Donald Trump way. I knew that what he wanted to do was somehow punish Assad and not let him get away with this.
The risk of inaction had become apparent, and the president felt very strongly that it was time really to try to reimpose some form of deterrence against Assad.
24 hours later, McMaster was back with plans for a missile strike against Syrian government targets. Trump had campaigned on getting out of wars in the Middle East. Now, he was poised to launch a major military operation.
The president said, okay, well, do I need to make a decision right now? I made the recommendation that he should try to make it as soon as possible, really for the principal reason that the more gap there was in time, the more that what the United States did in response could be disassociated from this egregious attack.
Trump broke off the meeting. He had to get to Florida, where he was due to host Chinese President Xi Jinping for their first summit.
Just a follow on that, though. Do you think that Assad should leave power in Syria?
I think what happened in Syria is a disgrace to humanity. And he's there, and I guess he's running things. So something should happen. Thanks, folks. I'll see you in a while.
Mar-a-Lago is spectacular. The most glamorous Gilded Age private home in America. Every surface of it is covered with frescoes, gilt, sparkling lights. It was just glitz and glamour, over-the-top Trump style.
You can imagine it was a high degree of concurrent activity there. As we were walking into Mar-a-Lago, the president was picking out the candelabras that he wanted at the dinner table with Xi Jinping.
The first thing we did is we went into the secure facility where the president had all the advisors to make a decision about whether or not we were going to bomb Syria in retaliation for some of the chemical weapon attacks.
We were in the White House Situation Room while President Trump and Secretary of State and others were in Mar-a-Lago.
The idea was to use about 60 Tomahawk missiles that were very precise and could hit targets exactly.
One of my colleagues suddenly realized one of the sites that was being targeted was where there was actually a contingent of Russian military officials, advisors to the Syrian government. We would have to take very special care to make sure that there was no inadvertent Russian casualties, because of course that could then set in motion a whole different chain of events.
This had blown up in his face. If the Tomahawk missiles had gone off the target and landed in the population center. He was with the first important summit meeting with President Xi Jinping of China. A mistake at this particular moment would have colored the rest of his presidency. The whole world was watching.
He had a couple of minutes of contemplation, then he delivered to Secretary Mattis his final decision.
I just want to say it's a great honor to have the President of China in the United States.
President Trump and President Xi were sitting on one side of the table, sitting side by side with their interpreters, with staff around the room. We did see at that moment, the military aide leaned over to the president and whispered in his ear something. We all on the American side knew exactly what he was telling him. President Trump said to President Xi, I just want you to know before dinner's over that we launched a very pinpointed missile attack on Syria tonight.
Trump, for weeks afterwards, just loved telling this story. He said, the Chinese president, through an interpreter, just looked at me, and then he said, repeat. So the interpreter repeated, and then the Chinese president looked at President Trump and said to the interpreter, repeat again. And then Donald Trump said, and I sat there with the biggest, most beautiful piece of chocolate cake, and I just smiled.
At the U.S. president's orders, 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles have hit a Syrian airbase. This strike is one of the most significant U.S. military responses to Bashar al-Assad's regime.
What I did should have been done by the Obama administration a long time before I did it. They had a big attack right after he drew the red line in the sand. They had a very big attack, and everybody waited, what's going on, and nothing happened.
5 years earlier, Barack Obama had said that the use of chemical weapons in Syria was a red line. But when Assad used sarin gas, killing hundreds, Obama and his European allies failed to act. Trump didn't consult Congress or even inform his European allies.
Nous n'avons connu le jour que lorsque la frappe a eu lieu. Et nous n'avons eu les résultats qu'ensuite. Donc c'était vraiment la preuve que Donald Trump ne voulait pas être avec les Européens. Alors pourquoi Donald Trump a-t-il procédé ainsi? Pour une seule raison, montrer qu'il était différent de Barack Obama. Finalement, cette opération n'était qu'une opération de communication.
Trump's foreign policy included some eye-catching ambitions. One of the boldest was to forge peace in the Middle East, something which had eluded his predecessors.
We have in the audience a special person who's worked very hard, who married very well.
Improbably, he gave the task to a 36-year-old businessman, his son-in-law.
If you can't produce peace in the Middle East, nobody can. Okay? All my life, I've been hearing that's the toughest deal in the world to make. And I've seen it. But I have a feeling that Jared is going to do a great job. I have a feeling he's going to do a great job.
Jared Kushner had no experience in diplomacy, but in Trump's eyes, he had a useful qualification: a family friendship with the Prime Minister of Israel.
I've known President Trump and his team for many years. Can I reveal, Jared, how long we've known you? Well, he was never small. He was always big. He was always tall.
Bibi and I have known each other a long time. A smart man, great negotiator. And I think we're going to make a deal. It might be a bigger and better deal than people in this room even understand. That's a possibility.
At their first summit, Netanyahu made a radical proposal. For decades, US presidents had seen an agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians as the cornerstone of Middle East peace. He wanted to bypass the Palestinians completely.
Prime Minister Netanyahu, he said, let's start with the moderate Sunni countries in the Gulf, with Saudi, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Sudan, Emirates, others, and then we will proceed to the Palestinians.
The Prime Minister did his best to convince President Trump that there was a real possibility of a strategic breakthrough with the Arab states. So that was a main focus of the conversations with President Trump in that first meeting.
It was so confidential that it was one of the few meetings that I even didn't write my notes to the computer.
Netanyahu told Trump that to unite Israel and the Gulf states, they should focus on a common enemy.
Every terror activity that is in the world today is backed by Iran. Supporting terror organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, everything is backed by Iran.
Prime Minister Netanyahu laid his cards on the table with what he saw as the Iran threat. He made it very clear that the Iran threat is the single most threat to the region.
When Israelis and Arabs are Arab leaders are on the same page when it comes to Iran, people should pay attention.
And President Trump told him, you know, what you are saying makes sense. Maybe I have to build my plan based on these ideas. And he is a businessman. We want to act, to have the business done.
Trump charged Kushner with starting talks with Gulf leaders.
He just listened. So many of our experts come to the region and they've already worked out in their head how the Middle East is going to organize itself because they've written 5 books on how the Middle East should organize itself. And Jared comes in and he's like, so what's on your mind? And they say, well, Iran, jobs, extremism, radicalization. Still listening for the Palestinians. I still don't hear it.
People realize that the real threat to that region is Iran and their aggression, and Israel and a lot of the other Arab states have a lot more in common today than they did before.
Kushner suggested an audacious move. The president could use his first overseas trip to start building a coalition for his peace plan. Trump seized on an invitation from Saudi Arabia.
Il aurait pu aller à Berlin. Il aurait pu aller à Londres pour montrer combien il était convaincu de l'utilité du Brexit. Mais en fait, Pour lui, l'Europe est un embarras. C'est une concurrence commerciale, ce sont des pays qui défendent des valeurs, des principes. Donc il a voulu montrer que les temps avaient changé et qu'il allait faire de la diplomatie américaine, non pas une diplomatie de sécurité, mais une diplomatie d'affaires.
By the time Trump touched down, Kushner had personally negotiated over $100 billion worth of arms deals with the Saudis. Even the ailing King Salman bin Saud came to the airport to greet his guests.
The Saudis pulled out all the stops for President Trump. And what the Saudis wanted to do was convince the United States, convince Donald Trump, you're welcome, right? And we want you in the region. We want to work with you in the region.
We understood that the president comes from a show business background. So a show was put in place. It was a bit of glitz, but he likes glitz.
When we came up and coming up we were in the car following the president, you could hear it from almost a half a mile away. And when you came up, they were all there with the swords. It was kind of a war chant. You really thought you were something on the set of Lawrence of Arabia.
The show included, of course, the dance of the swords.
Saudi Arabia came up with the idea of bringing the heads of state of the Muslim world. That was a very important symbolic opportunity for him to come and address 50 Muslim leaders. And I think Saudi Arabia did a very good job in bringing them all together.
The magnitude and the breadth and depth of what was going on was nothing short of extraordinary. It was this very large room that tears up with many big, huge desks, and the president gets up in front of the room and starts delivering a speech with all of these Middle Eastern heads of state sitting, taking notes and listening to what the president is talking about.
We must be united in pursuing the one goal that transcends every other consideration. I am speaking, of course, of Iran.
We knew that there was a big opportunity to organize a lot of Arab nations against the common threat of Iran.
It is a government that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing the destruction of Israel, death to America, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this very room.
After the president's speech, I was meeting with a number of Arab foreign ministers, and they said, finally somebody who understands the Middle East.
After the summit, Trump and his team made another unprecedented move, a direct flight from Saudi Arabia to Israel.
I remember taking screenshots of the video on Air Force One showing us where it says Riyadh to Tel Aviv.
Getting from certain Arab-speaking nations to Israel is not easy because they diplomatically have never recognized each other. They don't allow each other to use airspace. It was a really seismic, interesting moment where we say, is this potentially a break of something that we could look forward to in the future?
Trump headed straight to Jerusalem.
We had very much wanted President Trump to visit the Western Wall, also unprecedented for a president. It was just amazing to see him walk up to the wall and say a prayer.
It was a very touching moment and action for the citizens of Israel to see President Trump putting the kippah on his head, going to the most holy place for the Jewish people. So it was a real message. It is meaning the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, it's something that is going to happen.
The U.S. Embassy had always been in Tel Aviv. Trump had pledged to move it to the contested city of Jerusalem, an act bound to provoke the Palestinians. But they thought he'd made them a different promise at their first meeting 3 weeks earlier.
I remember very well President Trump saying, I know that Netanyahu would want to pocket Jerusalem. I will not do that. I will not do that, he said, and I promise this issue and all other issues will stay, and it will be a matter for both of you to decide on. President Trump said, I will not do that. I will not do that. He repeated it 3 times.
The day after his visit to the Western Wall, Trump went to see the president of the Palestinian Authority.
The most important part of the Trump visit to Bethlehem was the discussion on the political process. He said, you know what, let's start immediately. And then he said, you know what, let's do it Monday, next Monday. Send your negotiators.
President Trump was once again a motivator, trying to get them in a room together with the Israelis and let's really talk and figure out, can this conflict be resolved in a way that both sides can accept?
I went immediately to prepare for my negotiators, my leadership, my team to arrive to Washington.
At the end of his first trip to the Middle East, Trump announced he was on the verge of cracking a deal.
I had a meeting this morning with President Abbas and can tell you that the Palestinians are ready to reach for peace. I know you've heard it before. I am telling you, that's what I do.
Others on his team were less optimistic. During their meeting, the Palestinians had repeated their long-standing red lines for a deal: Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and recognizing East Jerusalem as their capital.
It became clear that the Palestinians were not really interested in negotiations, but more interested in us demanding of Israel certain preconditions. And we saw no purpose in trying to get the 2 sides into a room at that time to negotiate.
Many Mondays passed. The White House negotiations Trump promised never materialized.
Every time I knocked the door, that door was closed. Okay, let's see later, we will discuss later. And it ended up, every time I would approach the White House, the Trump team, Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt, blocked that completely.
Four months later, Trump was preparing to make his debut at the United Nations General Assembly.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Donald Trump, President of the United States of America.
It was the ideal platform to enlist the world in his crusade against Iran.
None of us went to the General Assembly to watch him, as we expected the statement to be negative. We watched it on television.
It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy.
His attacks on Iran were extremely harsh.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me.
What was totally lost for President Trump was that this was not a bilateral agreement between Iran and the U.S. It was an international obligation of the United States endorsed by a Security Council resolution, which the United States itself sponsored.
The deal to stop Iran developing nuclear weapons was the result of a decade of painstaking negotiations by the US, Russia, China, and Europe.
Don't imagine that one country does or dismantles the agreement. This is a UN Security Council resolution.
But for Trump, New York tough talk was just an opening gambit.
After the speech, I had a busy schedule that took me around town.
But I received a call from Secretary Tillerson's Chief of Staff asking me to return to the U.S. delegation headquarters at the Lotte Palace Hotel.
Thomas Shannon worked on the Iran deal during the Obama administration and had stayed on to ease the transition. He was told that Trump wanted to meet the president of Iran.
I remember looking at the Chief of Staff with a certain amazement, thinking to myself, my God, the president has just slammed the Iranians in a speech. Knowing the Iranians, this was not going to be an easy ask. I called my counterpart, Abbas Araghchi.
آقای شانن گفت که رئیس ما میخواد با رئیس شما صحبت کنه. امشب هتل پالاس ساعت 7. من واقعا چند لحظه اصلا موندم که چی باید جواب بدم.
There was a marked silence on the other end of the phone, and then a short laugh.
هم خندم گرفته بود، هم تعجب کرده بودم، هم فکر میکردم که اینا فکر میکنن با کی طرفن. من گفتم که من خب این پیام رو منتقل میکنم ولی امیدی نداشته باش.
It was obvious that we would not be responding positively, not just because of the statement, but because of the manner in which the request had been made. A diplomatic request is different from a boss calling his employees and saying that I want to see you at this time, at this place.
Trump wasn't giving up. He tried another intermediary, the new French president.
Je suis avec le président de la République qui va rencontrer la communauté française de New York. Donc nous sommes juste sur le point d'y aller. Coup de téléphone de Tillerson et qui dit à Emmanuel Macron, le président Trump veut rencontrer le président Rouhani, le président iranien. Pouvez-vous arranger cette affaire? Le président dit oui, j'essaye. Du coup, il appelle immédiatement Rouhani et ce qui n'est pas surprenant. Rouhani répond Trump vient d'insulter mon pays à la tribune. Politiquement, je ne peux pas le rencontrer dans ces circonstances.
When Macron involved himself, they became deeply concerned because they thought to themselves, my God, what's going to happen if Macron shows up at our hotel with President Trump and knocks on our door? What are we going to do? And I was told at the time that the decision was made that if Macron knocks on the door, we're going to have to open the door. So actually, a meeting could have happened.
Back in Washington, Trump's threat of immediate withdrawal from the Iran deal was worrying his national security team. Secretary of Defense James Mattis was summoned to testify before Congress.
Mattis has grown incredibly concerned that America seems to be abandoning our long-standing alliances and our allies. We're stepping away from a lot of international agreements. And now as we're sitting in his office and we're discussing his testimony preparations, Mattis looks across the table at me and says, it's incredibly important that as we write my testimony, you make it clear that when America gives her word, she should keep it. We should not be withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear agreement.
If we can confirm that Iran is living by the agreement, I believe at this point in time, absent indications to the contrary, it is something the president should consider staying with.
Secretary Mattis, do you believe it's in our national security interest at the present time to remain in the JCPOA? That's a yes or no question.
Yes, Senator, I do.
The point he made to Senator King was not part of his prepared remarks. He knew that it would put him in a bad spot with the president, but he felt compelled to say that leaving the JCPOA was the wrong course.
There was no reaction from the White House, not even the customary presidential tweet. 6 months after the visit to the Middle East, Jared Kushner was pushing on with his peace plan. Now, the US embassy issue was coming to a head. For decades, presidents had signed a waiver which stopped the embassy in Israel moving to the disputed city of Jerusalem. Trump had to decide whether he would do the same.
Mr. Kushner had asked for a meeting. Saab Erekat, he said, tomorrow President Trump must sign this waiver for moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, to which Jared Kushner said they are not sure if they will sign the waiver.
We said, look, we're a much different administration than perhaps you're accustomed to. We think that this is the historic, correct, and just decision for Israel, and we're going to follow through on it.
I remember coming in and saying to Jared that if this happens, Jared, this will be the last meeting between us. You could see in his face, in his body language, when he hears something that he doesn't like, he switches off. And his face becomes red. He's not there for a conversation. He's not there for a discussion. He's there to deliver. I just wanted to make sure at the end that Jared knows if he does that, he will never see us again. And that's exactly the last sentence I said. This will be the last meeting between us. And it was indeed the last meeting between us.
Trump decided to go ahead with the embassy move. The Palestinian Authority severed all communication with his administration.
وإذا كان البيت الأبيض سيكون بيت المسؤولية الدولية فيجب أن يديره رجال دولة عظام وليس رجال عقارات. هذه الحقيقة. فلسطين لن تحل بأساليب رجال العقارات.
While previous presidents have made this a major campaign promise, they failed to deliver. Today, I am delivering.
You may recall that this was another one of the president's campaign promises.
And Trump, when he was candidate, Trump promised to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
We thank you, O Lord, for President Donald Trump's courage in acknowledging to the world a truth established 3,000 years ago, that Jerusalem is and always shall be the eternal capital of the Jewish people.
We want America to be great again.
Tens of millions of evangelicals who had helped Trump get elected were ecstatic.
And we know we have a president who wants to make America good.
Less than a year into office, their president had delivered. Having satisfied his friends, Trump now turned his attention to his #1 enemy. He claimed that the Iran nuclear deal gave the regime billions of dollars to finance terrorism. The Europeans were told they had 4 months to fix it, or the US was out. They started frantic negotiations with the State Department.
Thousands of hours had gone into this, and to unravel this seemed to those people who had sat at the negotiating table almost impossible.
After weeks of negotiations, they thought they'd nearly cracked it.
We got to, I think, in the negotiations, it felt like within about 2 or 3 sentences of a text we could all agree. What we never knew was what the White House really thought about the process. That was the trouble.
A month before the deadline, Trump sent a clear signal when he appointed a new hardliner.
And my feeling was, when I arrived in April of 2018, that it was long overdue to withdraw. I told my own staff at the NSC in our first discussions that all of the talk about fixing the 2015 deal was off and that we were going to withdraw, because I thought that's what Trump had said he wanted to do in 2016 and what I still thought he wanted to do.
Desperate to avoid the deal collapsing, the French president embarked on a charm offensive.
You have not been in the Oval Office. This is where I speak to your husband.
Macron proposed that he and Trump go off by themselves to try and close the remaining issues in disagreement that had been negotiated at a much lower level.
On a d'abord découvert, excusez-moi, mais que Trump ne savait même pas qu'il y avait une négociation. Et à un moment, Macron m'a raconté qu'il a donné le nom du négociateur américain. Et Trump a répondu, mais qui c'est? Il ne savait même pas qu'il y avait une négociation. Et là, Trump dit à Macron en tête-à-tête, je vais sortir de l'accord. Et il dit même, je ne le dis qu'à toi, je ne l'ai pas dit à Melania. Comme s'il parlait politique avec Melania. Mais bon.
Macron, in effect, was rebuffed by Trump withdrawing from the deal. So he was looking for some way to try and save face.
Lorsqu'ils sortent, ensuite, il y a une réunion élargie avec les délégations.
We're going to have a short little meeting, and it turned out to be a long meeting.
Macron essaye de dire à Trump, ou d'accord, mais essayons de lancer une négociation globale.
Well, Macron thought that one way to save the deal was to try to address the inadequacies of the nuclear deal itself by talking about a much bigger negotiation.
We know everything about the treaties and the international agreements, but I think beyond that we have a lot in common to work on, and we will follow up this.
Macron pitched a broader deal, which would address Trump's concerns about Iran sponsoring terror in the region.
On voyait bien que Trump était, je dirais, ennuyé par la conversation, parce que Trump n'entre jamais dans le détail, ne connaît pas les détails, et il dit oui, je suis d'accord. Donc, comme vous pouvez l'imaginer, pour Emmanuel Macron pensait avoir le succès diplomatique de sa vie.
The French president left Washington with what he took as a promise to stay in the deal. But Trump wouldn't confirm it in public. 2 days later, it was Angela Merkel's turn.
Chancellor, I want to congratulate you once again on your election victory, 4th term in office. It's really something. Congratulations.
Europe's most experienced negotiator wanted Trump to confirm that the US would stay in the deal.
Merkel, also in a mission to try and save the deal, tried to make many of the same points that Macron had made, but we really didn't end up talking about Iran that much.
Trump still wouldn't be drawn. 5 days before the deadline, he tweeted, the British Foreign Secretary had just landed in Washington.
Boris was on a last-ditch mission to see if we could find some fixes for these remaining problems. And I think he had some possible language for these still outstanding sentences. We go in for a meeting with the Secretary of State, with Mike Pompeo.
It's great. These are important times. So thank you very much for being here.
Of course, he tries to say, well, I'm sure we could have found a way through on this to see if it was still possible to work up a final text and sell it to the White House. And the Secretary of State basically said, nope, it's all over. The President decided it's done.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Today's action sends a critical message. When I make promises, I keep them.
Mr. President, how does this make America safer?
Thank you very much. This will make America much safer. Thank you very much.
Trump had campaigned on a promise to put America first, including the pledge to bring troops home from costly foreign wars.
After 15 years of wars in the Middle East, after trillions of dollars spent and thousands of lives lost, the situation is worse than it has ever been before.
About 2,000 American soldiers were stationed in Syria, part of a coalition fighting ISIS. While Trump wanted them back, most of his national security team disagreed.
Well, the fact was, in Syria, the U.S. presence was providing security in an area in northeast Syria that kept out the Iranians and kept the Russians and Assad's forces out of that territory as well.
But Trump had support from another interested party, President Erdogan of Turkey.
Suriye toprakları tüm teröristlerden arındırılana kadar bu ülkedeki faaliyetlerimizi artırarak devam ettireceğiz.
The Kurds had been America's key allies in the battle against ISIS in Syria. But the Turkish president saw them as terrorists. If Trump withdrew troops, he'd be free to attack. Erdogan was pushing him hard.
President Trump essentially said to President Erdogan, call me anytime. We'll make sure you have my personal number. Well, of course, there is no such thing as a personal number. It's the White House switchboard. That personal invitation to call the personal number, President Erdogan took as an invitation to call whenever anything was on his mind. Pretty much every phone call, Erdogan would try to get the president on his own. Everybody would be scrambling around to get an interpreter to be next to the president on the golf course, who would have to be patched in on the phone, and there would be no time for a briefing. Erdogan would try to get that commitment to withdraw from Syria.
President Trump was not clear on why we had troops. The way we papered that over was basically to tell him, hey, boss, this is no problem. You got troops there, but they're not costing you very much. There are no casualties and such. And when he has to deal with Erdogan screaming and yelling, he's suddenly wondering, wait, what's going on? They said that this was no problem, that I could just leave the troops there, nobody would bother, I could just sleep soundly. And now I have Erdogan for the X time in 6 months screaming at me about this.
10 days before Christmas, the president took yet another call from Erdogan. This one turned out to be pivotal.
Clearly, Erdogan was very frustrated. And the president himself was getting frustrated by Erdogan getting frustrated. Erdogan said, you're not in control of all of your various generals, national security staff, the State Department. President Trump, he said, yes, absolutely, you're right, we're out. Ambassador Bolton immediately leapt up out of his seat.
Well, I didn't throw my hands up in the air because that would have lost the phone, but I thought this is exactly the wrong thing to do at this time.
We've been fighting for a long time in Syria. I've been president for almost 2 years, and we've really stepped it up. And we have won against ISIS. And now it's time for our troops to come back home.
It was a hammer blow for the U.S. military.
To Secretary Mattis, he just expressed his frustration with the fact that we look poor to our allies and partners around the world because no one has any idea what America's going to do in the next moment.
I happened to be waiting outside to come in to the Oval Office on something completely unrelated when Trump and Mattis came out, and it was clear to me intuitively that something big had just happened.
Breaking news, Secretary of Defense James Mattis, the man President Trump once called one of his generals, is resigning.
Well, I'll tell you what, this dropped like a bombshell here at the White House.
Trump took me back into the Oval Office and proceeded, as he often did, to denigrate Mattis. So in a way, it was Trump, in his own mind, building the case for how he fired Mattis, which is what he liked to say. Nobody ever resigns on Trump. He fires them first. Christmas night, we took off from Andrews Air Force Base to head to an American base in Iraq. It was the president's first trip in Iraq, and we met there with some of the commanding officers for them to brief him on the situation. At that point, I thought we were going to withdraw from Syria. I thought the decision had been made. I didn't see how to turn it around.
The military commanders sat Trump down and presented the case for keeping troops in the region.
That to me was a turning point. The briefing that Trump got in the desert there, I think convinced him that, number one, we could still do enormous damage to ISIS, and that the American presence in northeast Syria also helped keep Iran from achieving its objectives. And I don't think without that briefing it would have been possible to maintain U.S. forces in Syria.
Trump agreed that U.S. troops would remain. This time, there was no great announcement. But Erdogan wasn't giving up. 9 months later, he called Trump and told him he was sending troops into northeast Syria. As the Turkish army prepared to move in on the Kurds, Trump ordered the U.S. military out.
Turkish jets began striking America's allies, the Kurds of Syria, after President Trump ordered U.S. troops to step aside.
The world watched in horror.
Turkey isn't holding back, attacking U.S. allies, the Kurds in Syria, with artillery and airstrikes.
The Kurds then turned to Russia for protection.
So we faced suddenly the Russians coming in, the Turks coming in. So we decided, why don't we stay on? The president was asking for arguments to do so. Somebody came up with protecting the oil fields. The president was very, very clear that he loved the idea. It seemed to be creative. He thought he could sell it to his base.
We don't want to keep soldiers between Syria and Turkey for the next 200 years. They've been fighting for hundreds of years. We're out. But we are leaving soldiers to secure the oil. Now, we may have to fight for the oil. That's okay. Maybe somebody else wants the oil, in which case they have a hell of a fight.
In the years since withdrawing from the nuclear deal, America had been piling pressure on Iran.
Yeah, we're moving forward with additional sanctions on Iraq. Good question. As you know, we have about as strong a sanction grouping as you could possibly have on any country.
The United States started a totally different and new approach to Iran. It's not just sanctions, it's economic war. A comprehensive war which tries to wage a battle in every front, whether it's banking, food, medicine, oil, against Iran.
The plan was to bring Iran's government to heel. Instead, Iranian aggression got worse.
Breaking overnight, a U.S. drone shot out of the sky by Iran.
Iran has shot down a U.S. drone in what the Pentagon is calling an unprovoked attack.
خب به ذهنم اومد که شاید یک پهپاد کوچکی بوده در خلیج فارس که به شلیک شده و ساقط شده، ولی حدود ظهر که اخبار این پهپاد بیشتر آمد و ما متوجه شدیم که این چه غولی بوده در آسمان که بهش شلیک شده و ساقط شده. خب من با آقای ظریف گفتم که ما خلاصه یک موضوع داریم. We have a situation.
This drone was in international waters. Clearly, we have it all documented. It's documented scientifically, not just words. And they made a very bad mistake.
The president gathered his top advisors in the Situation Room.
I felt it was a very thorough NSC session. The costs and benefits were analyzed. It was kind of a textbook way of how you make an interagency decision in the national security space. I thought the president had made the right decision. At that point, there seemed nothing more to do but to implement it.
Trump signed off on a strike against Iranian military targets. It was set for 9 o'clock that night.
We heard from people in the Pentagon that they'd all been asked to stay on that evening, and if you put two and two together, an American drone has just been shot down. There's lots of discussion about an Italian-American response, and then the Pentagon press corps had been told to hang around that evening for some unknown announcement at 9 o'clock that night. You could kind of guess what was coming.
Well, at a certain point in the afternoon, everything's in the hands of the military. So I went home to change clothes, figuring I could be at the White House all night as these things go.
As night drew in, ships were moved into position, while US bombers and fighter jets prepared to take off.
When I was driving back in, I got to the White House after getting through a traffic jam on the bridge over the Potomac River. We got word that the president wanted to speak to all of us. I went to the Oval Office. He announced that he had decided to cancel the response literally within minutes of the last go, no-go point. And it turned out that a lawyer on the White House staff had come in with very inaccurate estimations of what the casualties of the response might be, with no coordination with anybody. And the president said, I don't want to see a lot of body bags of dead Iranians.
Here we are sitting with 150 dead people
that would have taken place probably within a half an hour after I said go ahead. And I didn't like it.
Here, we had done it absolutely by the book. By the book. And suddenly somebody runs in out of the blue and everything is turned 180 degrees. It's not a question whether he called it off or not. In a different scenario, this person could have run in and the decision could have been to reverse and attack. It's not the outcome of the president's chaotic decision-making, it's the chaotic decision-making which inevitably leaves the United States at greater risk.
John Bolton resigned 3 months later. Trump again tweeted that he fired him. But Iran wasn't safe for long. At the end of December, an American contractor was killed in Iraq. The US blamed militia backed by Iran. Days later, Trump had his chance to strike back.
A rocket attack on the Baghdad airport kills Iran's most revered military leader.
Qasem Soleimani was one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East.
General Soleimani commanded Iran's operations abroad.
We knew his record of killing Americans very well. The president made the decision, in order to protect American lives, to take Qasem Soleimani off the battlefield.
This was an act of blatant aggression and terrorism by the United States. Our first priority was to have a proper commemoration of our beloved general.
Hundreds of thousands of Iranians took to the streets of Tehran to mourn.
The top military advisor to Iran's supreme leader said that America has started a war and the U.S. should expect an appropriate military reaction.
The world braced itself for war. It didn't come.
And last week, the United States once again took the bold and decisive action to save American lives and deliver American justice. And you know what I'm talking about.
For Trump, it was a spectacular way to launch his election campaign.
We need this next election so badly. The good news is it's much easier, because here I've done it all. I've achieved more than I promised.
Having come to the brink of war with Iran, Trump was still pursuing peace in the Middle East. The Palestinians were out in the cold, but Kushner was approaching a breakthrough between Israel and some of the Gulf states.
Over the course of many months, delegations met in Washington, in Israel, and UAE to deepen cooperation on diplomatic efforts, defense efforts, security efforts. And I remember at the end of our first meeting, the Israeli ambassador said to me, "This meeting really is the path to normalization."
I said, if people knew the types of meetings that were happening underneath the surface, they would be shocked. And I saw this process of Israel and the Arab states. It was almost like an iceberg. We were sort of building everything underneath the surface so that ultimately it would penetrate.
Just when an agreement was looking close, Netanyahu confirmed he was pushing ahead with controversial plans to annex Palestinian land in the West Bank.
חבלי ארץ אלו הם מחוזות לידתה וצמיחתה של האומה היהודית. הגיע הזמן להחיל עליהם את החוק הישראלי ולכתוב פרק מפואר נוסף בתולדות הציונות.
The Emirates made very clear that if the annexation continues, it's going to be very hard to continue the cooperation that was largely under the table between UAE and Israel.
The Emiratis suggested a trade-off. If Netanyahu put the annexations on hold, UAE was ready to sign a peace deal with Israel.
And that ended up being the critical moment. We all took a step back and did everything we could to avoid a break between UAE and Israel, which had been very productive under the table. And then UAE was willing to come out in broad daylight and normalize with Israel if Israel was willing to suspend annexation. And everybody saw an opportunity for a win.
The White House contacted me, and one of the things we had to do was use what Kissinger called constructive ambiguity in the language. They wanted what is often called annexation to be permanently taken off the table. We were not willing to do it, and we chose the word suspension. Suspension is a word which really leaves a big question mark over time.
Israel's agreed to suspend the annexation, to suspend applying Israeli law to those areas for the time being. But in the future, it's a discussion that I'm sure will be had.
And that was the word that I think created, if you will, a suspension bridge for the Emiratis to move into a peace agreement with Israel.
My biggest concern is we're making this look too easy. I mean, seriously.
Just a few moments ago, I hosted a very special call with two friends, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates, where they agreed to finalize a historical peace agreement.
I learned about it from Trump Twitter. And I remember very well saying, what? Is this real? Frankly, I must admit, with all the relations and the contacts, and it was unexpected to me. And I think it was, by and large, unexpected to our leadership and our people.
A month later, Bahrain joined the UAE in establishing full diplomatic relations with Israel. Sudan and Morocco soon followed suit. But the Palestinians were still out in the cold. On his last day in office, the president talked about his achievements.
As a result of our bold diplomacy and principled realism, we achieved a series of historic peace deals in the Middle East. Nobody believed it could happen.
He highlighted even his most controversial decisions.
We recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We stood up to the oppressive Iranian regime and killed the world's top terrorist, Iranian butcher Qasem Soleimani.
Yet peace between Israel and the Palestinians looked as far away as ever. Iran's hardliners had been empowered, and the country's nuclear program was accelerating. President Biden has said the US may rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. In the next episode, Trump turns to Asia in a battle for global supremacy. He makes friends with a dictator and tries to strike the deal of the century.
Trump said, well, you know, I hear people saying that maybe I should get a third term. This is the affinity that Trump has with authoritarian leaders. Xi Jinping doesn't have term limits, and I think Trump envied that.
What influence did Trump's extensive use of social media have on global affairs? Discover the impact of Trump's tweets at bbc.co.uk/TrumpTakesOnTheWorld and follow the links to the Open University.